We'll make a start then, Michael. So, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all safe and well. Welcome to the Province of West Lancashire Provincial Office webinar, with a special welcome to those joining from other provinces and to those watching on YouTube Live. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. My name is Andrew Rydell, and I'm the Provincial Deputy Grand Secretary. You can join the conversation today using the comments on YouTube and the chat function on Zoom. I'll be checking both throughout the session, so if you have any questions, comments or observations, please post them there. So, to today's session. Michael Ramos is the Lodge Development Manager for the Grand Lodge of California, aiding the formation of new lodges and the strategic placement of the fraternity throughout the state. He also serves as a co-producer of the online Masonic speaker service and is a regular contributor to the California Freemason magazine. Michael is also a member of several lodges in UGLE and is therefore in a unique position to give a perspective on the future and development of Freemasonry on both sides of the pond. Michael, good morning to you. I know it's early there. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to the province of West Lancashire. How are you and what have you been up to for the last 12 months?
Oh, my brother, thank you so much for having me, distinguished brother and brother-in-law. Thank you all for having me as a guest. What have I been doing? Working. Oddly enough, California is probably one of the rare Masonic jurisdictions that during this time of COVID, where we have not been meeting, obviously, we haven't been meeting since March of last year, we've still instituted 5, 6, 7, and we're coming up on 8, 9 new lodges during this time. So we're still growing. I'm staying busy at work. The online speaker series is humming. So I'm so busy that it's keeping me out of trouble. I hope that's a valid enough response, because it certainly is true.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you.
I'll let you launch straight into your presentation because I think people are probably sick and tired of my voice right now. Who's nodding? I can see people nodding. That's not good.
All right, brother, can I just get a thumbs up that you can see my share screen and you can hear me okay? All right, excellent. Okay, all right, so let me get myself situated here. So, brother, I was asked to come here today to speak to you about the craft in America, but most specifically, I'm going to give you a California perspective. Every state can operate slightly differently, so my focus is going to be on California. Hence, the title of my presentation, The Craft in America, a California Perspective for English Brethren. And what you see here on my title slide are what we call hieroglyphical charts, a little bit different than the tracing boards that my brethren on your side of the pond are accustomed to, but we'll discuss these a little bit further down the line. So typically at this point is where I explain why you should care about what I have to say. Our brother here, Andrew, did such a wonderful job with an intro. I really don't have to. I have extensive, I've had a fairly extensive journey thus far in the craft, as well as the Royal Arch and the progressive orders. But as he stated, what gives me a unique position in this conversation to be able to compare and contrast and discuss about what's happening in both sides of our neck of the woods is my involvement as well with lodges and some of the progressive orders in England, actually. So I'm a member of a lodge that meets at Great Queen Street. I'm a founder member of a Young Masons Lodge, Essex Cornerstone, that meets at Upminster. I am a Royal Arch Mason in the UK, as well as will soon to be perfected into the Rose Claw. So I have kind of an extensive background to some extent on both sides. So this topic is certainly in my wheelhouse. And this right here that's on the screen, brethren, this is actually a mural, a glass mural that's in the Grand Lodge of California on California Street. And something that is unique about this mural is that it actually contains natural elements from all the various states throughout the United States is actually contained within the artwork of this glass. So my presentation is broken down into a few segments here. I'm going to give you an extremely brief history of the craft in America. We're going to talk about some statistics, both USA and California driven, ideas around general governance, because it is a bit different. Talk about the workings of an American lodge. We're going to talk about ritual a bit. We're going to talk about composition comparison. We're going to talk about some unique aspects the Hieroglyphical Charts, the Customs and Culture, Regalia, the charitable campaigns and community partnerships, what the future holds, and then a conclusion. And if I provide a presentation worth it, we'll have a little bit of Q&A at the end. So a brief history of the craft in America. The craft was brought to North America in the early 1700s, mid 1700s, and spread throughout the British and French colonies. Even though such Grand Lodges as the Premier Grand Lodge had provincial Grand Masters here, and eventually even the Scottish Grand Lodge, Irish Grand Lodge, and some what we would consider irregular Grand Lodges were present and operating here in this country. Truly, it's thanks to the military lodges, which were under ancient, ancient Grand Lodge warrant, that the craft in North America flourished. With those of you familiar with the writings of Rick Berman, he has written extensively on this, the ancient Grand Lodge's effect on Freemasonry in the United States. Just some interesting side notes. Some of the earliest Royal Arch ceremonies, that doesn't mean the Royal Arch came from here. It just means some of the earliest recorded Royal Arch ceremonies come out of North America. In addition to that, other degrees were being worked here, as was extraordinarily common with any lodge holding an ancient's warrant, even external to the Royal Arch. Since it's coinciding with England, we've had an early exposure to things that would turn into the Mark degree. Early versions of Royal and Select Master degrees, Knights Templar, as well as some even today associated with the Allied Masonic degrees and the Appendant Orders of the Red Cross of Constantine. Overall, the feud between the Premier and Ancient Grand Lodge, it held little effect on the developing stream of American Freemasonry. American Freemasonry was truly turning into a beast of its own. And after the War of Independence, independent Grand Lodges prospered and helped American Freemasonry flourish even further. So some current statistics about Freemasonry in the USA. There are 50 Grand Lodges. Every Grand Lodge is sovereign. There is no United Grand Lodge of the Americas. The oldest independent Grand Lodge, and this is kind of an arguing point because some people from Pennsylvania will say it's theirs, but for our sake today, we're going to say it's Virginia, founded in 1778. And I'm talking about independent. So this is after, this is following the War of Independence. So we're talking about USA Grand Lodges. So Virginia, 1778, and the youngest is Hawaii, 1989. They actually used to, for a period, fall under the Grand Lodge of California. And even prior to that, that was actually a stronghold for French Freemasonry, working the craft degrees of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. And one of their last kings, there's some very interesting correspondence between him and a Mason named Albert Pike, which some of you might have heard of, who was certainly let's say, the poster child for promoting and helping kind of reorganize and rework the southern jurisdiction of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite here in the country. Currently, there's roughly about 2 million Masons in the USA. And that number actually is only half of what we had in the mid 20th century. So it's decreased. Millions are obviously donated to charity annually, and the most popular progressive order in this country is the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, which developed differently than the ancient and accepted Rite when that came to England. So there's certain prerequisites for membership within the ancient and accepted Rite in England, which are a little bit of a carryover as to how the Northern Masonic jurisdiction was operating at that moment in time. However, they no longer operate like that. So it's a little interesting that that one took such a strong hold in this country in particular. And after that, the Royal Arch, et cetera. So some California specific statistics. There are 350 lodges located throughout the state. There are roughly today about 45,000 members. The average age of a member is 60 years. The average lodge is made up of about 75 members, which is huge. That's 2 lodges in essence in UGLE. The oldest lodge is California Lodge number 1, and there's a brother on here that actually was stating that he's a member of Cal 1. And the youngest lodge is Andres Bonifacio Lodge under dispensation out of Gardena, California, which is by Los Angeles. They were virtually instituted, not consecrated. That's something different that only can occur in person, but they were virtually instituted to receive a dispensation of work just a few weeks back. There are 5 research lodges in the state. There are 2 historic lodges. A historic lodge is a designation where it's a lodge that meets in a certain area of California. It does not operate the degrees. It is purely social. And it has the intent of promoting aspects of California history. So usually these meet in the more rural areas, in areas typically associated with the California Gold Rush. And then we have what's called the Grand Master's Lodge. This is not a lodge that meets and convenes. It's actually just a holding lodge where brethren who are temporarily unattached, their membership moves to the Grand Master's Lodge after a year, if they so wish it. And this actually allows them to pay their subs, stay in good standing, and then eventually find a lodge to move on to. So speaking about general governance, how does this work in the state of California? And as I said, some states are a little bit different, but one thing that I can tell you is that we don't operate in the same manner as the United Grand Lodge of England does concerning metro breakouts, province. It's a little bit different. There is no, let's say, there's no microcosm of the Grand Lodge, so to speak, as you move down. It just becomes certain individuals who end up overseeing things. So in California, the way it operates, obviously, you have the Grand Lodge itself, the Grand Master, and then you have one of the many Grand Lodge officers who's called a Grand Lecturer. This is an elected grand office and usually is held for multiple years on end. The Grand Lecturer, in a sense, is the keeper of the ritual and operates in protocols, etc. He then has a series of assistant Grand Lecturers that are over divisions. These guys are located throughout the state. These are appointed and they report back up to the Grand Lecturer. And then under them are inspectors of a district. And there are a number of districts throughout the state. And an inspector acts more or less as an appointed grand representative who then oversees what we call in this jurisdiction subordinate lodges or constituent lodges, which you would call a private lodge. So that's the hierarchy here. And the inspector is truly there, and we'll talk about this in a bit, because America is kind of an oddball when it comes to certain things regarding ritual. Some states permit different workings of ritual. That's a very, very, very small handful. I wouldn't even say a handful, like three or four maybe. And then the rest are beholden to a certain type of ritual, and the inspector is supposed to aid the lodge in guaranteeing the proper methodology of working the ritual, as well as aid them in some administrative guidance. And then it kind of goes up the chute from there. So more on general governance, as I was saying, each state Grand Lodge is sovereign. The majority of Grand Officers serve 1 year, except the Grand Secretary, Treasurer, Lecturer, and or Organist. And that goes also for the equivalent thereof within the progressive orders. So for us, a Grand Master is elected by the membership and then serves a single year. And we also vote on our Deputy Grand, Senior Grand Warden, Junior Grand Warden, and the Junior Grand Warden recommendee who will end up coming in. So we vote on all of those, as well as our Grand Treasurer and Grand Secretary. However, Grand Secretary and Grand Treasurer tend to hang on. And I had already mentioned that we don't work in a provincial structure, but what I think is important to kind of talk about there next is that there is really no past grand rank. So the only way you're going to obtain past grand rank, and this differs just slightly in different states, but if you're a Grand Master who has served his term, you will maintain the title of past Grand Master. After a certain amount of years, our Grand Lecturer is entitled to such. There's other various grand offices where you'd have to serve actively for a period of years to obtain it. And our Grand Wardens could be awarded it if they fell, let's say, gravely ill during their term and they couldn't carry it out. Because the way our system works is that once you're in as the Junior Grand Warden, it is anticipated that you are, more than 9 times out of 10 going to progress and then become the Grand Master. It's just 1 year after next, like how the Craft Lodge line would work in a perfect world. But there is no, you've done a wonderful job. You're going to be, you are being appointed as a past Senior Grand Deacon. We're going to invest you. You're going to have different regalia, different title. That doesn't exist. You either are the senior grand deacon or you aren't. And after you've served a year, you do not maintain a past grand rank. I think that at some point during this development, it was perceived the same way like in a lodge, where if you served as senior deacon for your lodge, and then you are done serving as an officer in general, you just decide you don't maintain a past title for having served that role. So it's just a different structure. So the workings of an American lodge are no different in the sense of obviously the entered apprentice degree, fellow craft degree, and that of master mason. Since the Baltimore Convention, which was held in 1843, which invited all American Grand Lodges in existence at that time to attend to discuss a variety of matters, a whole slew of them. But one of the primary topics was trying to create a form of unified ritual all states over. This convention also attempted to de-Christianize the symbolism and institute other conformities. Each jurisdiction, as I was saying, so each Grand Lodge, this typically works its own correct version of the Preston-Webb, or what's called Barney or ancient workings, depending on where you are. It might be called something different. It's generally the same thing. Pennsylvania refused to attend this convention, so Pennsylvania works its own form of ritual, which they have maintained for quite some time. The District of Columbia permits lodges to choose which ritual it's going to work. That makes sense because DC is truly a cosmopolitan place in the sense where people from all over the world move there to operate because of the government. And Louisiana, and even in California, we have two lodges. In Louisiana, they permit some of their older French lodges to continue working the craft degrees of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. In California, we have two French working lodges who work the first degree of that, but they are mandated to then work the second and third degree in accordance with the rest of the lodges in the state. So I said Preston-Webb ritual. What is that? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with William Preston. There's a position there, the Prestonian lecturer, which I think all of you are definitely familiar with. That comes from his name. So William Preston compiled lectures and workings from all over the British Isles, according to him. Okay. With these, he created and or enhanced his own system of lectures and workings. He's very, very, very famous for his book, Illustrations of Masonry, which first came out in 1772 and had a slew of reprints, just an absolute slew. He was associated with the premier Grand Lodge, the ancient Grand Lodge, and then had his own failed Grand Lodge. He tried creating this Grand Lodge called the Grand Lodge south of the River Trent, and it just went horribly bad. He was a very interesting character, extremely well-learned individual. We owe him a ton in Masonry the world over, but he was certainly a character, and he would really eventually influence all forms of Anglo-Masonry. Well, a lot of his work ended up being, I'm not going to go into this story because this is a presentation in itself, but let's just say it made its way over to the USA through various people, then came to Thomas Smith Webb. Thomas Smith Webb, in some senses, is considered, kind of the regularizer of American Masonry. He inherited parts of Preston's system and blended it a bit with ancient working, reworded, rearranged, and re-edited some of it for the American tongue, and with this created his own system of lectures and workings for the what some people call for the York Rite version of Masonry. We'll talk about that in a second. He came out with a book called Freemason's Monitor or Illustrations of Masonry in 1797. And he was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Rhode Island. He helped found the Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons, and also served as a Grand Commander for the Grand Commandery Knights Templar in the United States. So I mentioned York Rite. What does that mean? I can tell you that the York Rite is an interesting phenomenon which exists, at least on paper, in America and in some other countries that we've heavily influenced their Masonry. Thomas Smith Webb came up with this idea. It basically, I call it a marketing campaign that got out of hand in the late 1700s, and you'll understand why. So his interpretation was that, well, to kind of make this feel like a rite, the idea being is that a Mason enters at the entered apprentice, goes up to become a master Mason of his lodge, He then moves into the Royal Arch chapter, which in America, the Royal Arch chapter also works the mark. You receive a demonstration of a version of the Board of Installed Masters. It's a demonstration, and it harkens, and it's not the same one that the majority of us are used to in England. But if you witness this, it's a callback to history of when you had to be a past master to receive the Royal Arch, which comes next. After that, it was anticipated that you would, once it was eventually formalized, you would join a Council of Royal and Select Masters, go through those degrees as worked in a council in America, which is Royal Master, Select Master, Super Excellent Master. And then, of course, you would want to complete your journey as a knight within a what we call a Commander of Knights Templar. So you can see this is just fairly odd in the sense of there's prerequisites in order to, let's say you do want to do these kinds of things. You might have to belong to chapter, mark, etc., but no one considers it a right. Well, I can tell you that in America, no one really considers it a right either. It's not a right for a number of reasons. It's not governed by one sole body. It's governed by 4 individual grand bodies: Grand Lodge, Grand Chapter, Grand Council, and Grand Commandery. But it was this way of him promoting his system that he wrote, so that you started here and then you ended up here. It's not very different than if you were in a country that works the ancient and accepted right from the first degree. That kind of weaving there, or in other countries like that work the RER, especially hearkening back to the days of the strict observance, etc. This was popular during the 1700s, this idea that you wanted to enter, then become a knight at some point. So this was called the American Rite or York Rite, and I can't stress enough that it really was just a marketing type campaign that got out of control. But the terminology is still used today. American versus English lodge composition. If you take a look here to the right, this is generally speaking the layout of an American Masonic lodge. J and B are physically in the room. They are physically there. And generally speaking, large and ornate. We do a lot of the work at a central altar in the middle of the floor. There are lights at that altar. I'm not going to get into a lot of esoteric stuff. What I mean by that is pure ritual comparison. But as you can see, the setup is different. We have stewards who are actually floor officers in the lodge that are involved with bringing the candidate into the lodge in the various degrees, instead of just working, let's say getting drink orders ready at the bar about 20 minutes before the meeting lets out. They're in here doing floor work with what we call rods. In England, it would be called wands. But as you look through here, you can see that the officers differ a bit. And as I'm saying, I'm focusing on California. Some jurisdictions might have an extra officer or two. They might have a master of ceremonies. They might have, they could have, in one jurisdiction, there's an officer called an electrician. There's different things, but I'm keeping it to California. So as you can see here, it differs. There is no DC. The closest thing that we have to that is a marshal. He does part of the DC's work. The rest of the DC's work would be done by someone called the officer's coach, which is appointed by the inspector. This is basically the only person who's permitted to prompt during a ceremony. Additionally, it is not common to see a lodge have an almoner or a charity steward. Those are usually taken up by committees instead of by an office. My lodge, Templum Rosae, number 863 in Oakland, California, we do have an almoner. We created the position because we found it important. However, charity work is done through a committee. There is no inner guard. That is not part of the Preston-Webb ritual, so to speak. As I said, stewards for us are floor officers. They can still do the work of a steward outside the lodge, but in the lodge, they are a floor officer that works with wands, and they actually sit, if you can look in this diagram, in front and off to the right and left sides of the junior warden on the floor. So, unique aspects. So here's me in my lodge after conferring a fellowcraft degree. American Masonic degrees are very dramatic. They are very, very, very experiential. They're very long. So we certainly have lectures and charges and all of that, but a lot of the ritual is truly a drama where the candidate is thrust into the act. That it's not much different than most Anglo-Masonry. However, in certain degrees, we certainly take it a bit further. American Freemasonry still retains some of its original Christian nature, such as where mention is made of Moses and Solomon. For us, that is the Holy Saint John the Baptist, Saint John the Evangelist. Lectures are mandatory. There is no escaping lectures after a degree, and they are quite extensive. You additionally get a charge as well. Ritual is mandatory. It's got to be memorized. It's mandatory. If you were caught with a ritual book open, dependent on the temperature and the circumstances, you could have your charter arrested for that. We have to do all ritual by memory, except a few things which we are allowed to read, which are very, very, very few and far between. The candidates' questions, they're quite extensive. So for an entered apprentice, it's about 5 to 7 pages worth of questions. For the fellow craft, roughly about the same. And for the master mason, it's huge. It's about 12 pages. And these include memorizing your obligation and being able to repeat that in open lodge. Additionally, in California, we have an online candidate education program, which this is required that they take this before they can be permitted to advance to the next degree, as well as perform what we call their catechism, which would be the series of questions. It's just a great deal longer. And they have to do this in open lodge, back and forth, with their mentor in front of the lodge. Additionally, there are online leadership and administrative management programs that are required by the Grand Lodge for the principal officers of a craft lodge to take. It's really just to prove that they're serious about the roles, teaches them a bit more about the administrative aspects of managing a Masonic lodge, and should teach them something in the process. The master, his wardens, and the senior deacon must prove their competency in the ritual to the inspector before they can be installed. So you can put them on the ballot. They can be elected to take the role, but they cannot be installed until they have proven that they have competency in the workings. Here in California, officer schools of instruction with an inspector are mandatory. These generally happen 10 times in a year. So, excuse me. We get about 2 months off, and the rest of the year we're doing those. And that's obviously outside of any LOIs or degrees or stated meetings that you're going to end up holding with your own lodge. As I was saying, there's no true inner workings for a master. On the day of his installation, these are received more or less as a class within masters and past masters associations, or symbolically, as I was mentioned, held within a Royal Arch chapter. The signs and working tools, just a side note, the signs are similar. We just have something that we add on to them at the very beginning, called a do-guard. And one word is slightly different, but that one word kind of moves around dependent where you are and what jurisdiction. All right, moving forward. Some more unique aspects. Lodges are mandated to conduct 12 business meetings per annum. So that means 1 business meeting per month, which involves a formal opening and closing, etc. So right there, a lodge is meeting at the bare minimum 12 times a year. Then you have to hold what are called special meetings, which are scheduled at the master's discretion. These special meetings are for degree ceremonies, installation, LOIs, etc. So a very busy lodge could end up meeting in some shape or form 8 to 10 times a month. Okay, that's a very, very, very busy lodge. In our jurisdiction, each installed lodge master, the current wardens, and a designated past master from the lodge, so you have 4 votes, are able to vote at Grand Lodge. So the way things work for us is we don't have a committee explaining that we believe this is the best thing, and hence that's why it's coming into fruition for us. We have committees that present what they believe is the best thing concerning legislation, meaning changes to our book of rules, which is called the California Masonic Code. And then from there, we are permitted to come down to the floor and speak for or against and vote. So it's a bit of a different process for that. Another thing is that yearly the Grand Lodge hosts retreats for secretaries and treasurers and masters and wardens, which serve kind of as a blend of education, best practices, and team building. And also the Grand Lodge is very active in trying to help its lodges. We aid them in tax filings, bankings, website creation, app creation, reporting, subs collection, prospecting, etc. We have a lot of services for the lodges. All right, customs and culture. So as with all other American Masonic bodies, a lodge will ultimately operate in a manner suiting its specific membership within, instead of within unwritten social or cultural norms. So what I mean by that is that being an English Mason as well, I know what I'm walking into 9 times out of 10, but more than that, when I attend a meeting, when I attend a festive board, I'm prepared, I'm ready to go. In America, it differs. You very much could have an anticipation. And when you show up, it could be very different than what you expect. Some lodges are extremely formal. So white tie, the festive boards are different because not all lodges inherently have an English style festive board. So the toasts can be different, protocol can be different. And then you'll have some lodges that don't have any of that. And they're meeting in jeans, tennis shoes, polo shirt, and it's very casual. The food is on paper plates. Sometimes their partners are in the banquet room preparing the meal while they're holding their meeting next door. It's much more of a family affair, a casual affair. And then you'll find some lodges, let's say in some more of the rural areas, where the guys show up to lodge in their overalls. You know, the master wears a Stetson. In American Freemasonry, especially in California Freemasonry, most jurisdictions mandate the master wears a hat. It's just part of the ritual. You know, so it really depends. Lodges mirror their communities. Lodges mirror their membership's wants and desires. Charity is directed through Grand Lodge initiatives and or direct community or organization involvement from the lodge. So that's not much different than what we see, at least with my lodges in England. As I was saying, dining might be formal or informal, might occur before the lodge is opened or after the lodge is opened. You know, it's always good, I think, when visiting an American Masonic lodge, just ask outright, what should I expect? Is dining going to be prior, before? Ask about attire, just because it's not set. Every lodge will operate differently. And subs range what in England, what's called subs, we call dues. And in England, what's called dues, we call per capita. But subs, let's say, range drastically dependent upon the lodge's needs and or the membership's wants in it for their own experience. So some lodges that have a lot of money, they could have dues as low as $25 per year. A lot of lodges in America own property. A lot of lodges are extremely wealthy, very wealthy. So the dues can be very low. Then some are smaller, want a higher end experience when it comes to dining, when it comes to their space that they meet in, et cetera. So some lodges could charge upwards of $2,500 per year. So getting on to Regalia, I'm showing you some extraordinarily standard stuff. This is extraordinarily standard right here. So I would call this the economy Regalia. So these can be purchased at Regalia manufacturers for an extremely affordable price. Very standard officer's apron. So one thing that's different too for us is that if the apron of a master mason is a white lambskin apron, no adornment. The apron of a past master is permitted to have an apron with the past master jewel, affixed, not the jewel physically, but I mean a bullion style sewn on version of the jewel. And so beyond that, officers have a bit of leeway, lodge officers, to what their aprons as officers will look like. So most American lodges have an officer's jewel specific on the apron, and that's what that officer wears. Craft lodges can wear chain collars. That's not odd. Big, heavy chain collars, which some people might associate more with grand rank, and the jewels do not differ beyond what might be the insignia. So again, standard Master Mason apron, and this right here is our Grand Master's apron. Okay. This is a past master's apron for California specific. This was made by a brother, Patrick Craddock, who owns a Regalia, a very, very high-end, beautiful handmade Regalia company in the United States. So he developed a California's past master's apron. One is sewn, one is hand-painted. And these are the hieroglyphical charts, as I mentioned earlier, just kind of tying it into lodge furniture, et cetera. So our lectures are extraordinarily long. They're extraordinarily detailed. So the problem is that trying to give one of our lectures off of a tracing board is just not going to happen. There's too much happening in our lectures to where you could jam all of this into, let's say, a scenic painting. So lodges used to use these quite regularly when lecturing, because this was their version of a tracing board to add a visual significance to what they were talking about to help make an impact on the candidate when they were receiving the lecture. These have fallen out of use primarily. I'm sure there's still a few lodges that use them, but primarily the lecture is the lecture, and you're receiving that from the master to the candidate directly without a significant amount of aid of visual items beyond furniture in the lodge, or some little items that might be pulled out for various lectures that call out certain things. So charitable campaigns and community partnerships. Again, this is California specific. Every state Grand Lodge supports its own charities. In California, we have the Masonic Homes of California. I highly recommend, brethren, that if you are just doing nothing one day and you're sitting there, please look up the Masonic Homes of California. It is just an incredible communities for our aged brethren and their significant others. A lot of long-term care, a lot of rehabilitation and Alzheimer's work. We're constantly being voted as one of the best facilities for such in the state of California year after year after year. And you've never been to a more vibrant Masonic community. It's just incredible the amount of stuff that they can get into every day. They have more energy than me. I'd be tired. I'd be, drawing the shades and trying to get some rest. It's an extremely, extremely active community, both Masonic and externally. There's a lot of activities and a lot of things happening there always. We have a Let's Write the Future campaign, which involves our aid to public schools when it comes to reading and writing and helping develop those programs within them. The Distress Worthy Brother campaign was developed during this time of COVID to aid those members that fell on extremely hard times, whether it be due to a loss of a job during this period or the loss of a direct family member, et cetera. We're there to aid our brothers in this means. Masons for Mitts is a program that we have with Major League Baseball throughout the state, where we donate and aid to underprivileged children that are getting active in sports, obviously as a means of having fun, but also as a means of, building up their self-esteem and learning more about themselves and teamwork, et cetera. So we donate baseball gloves, and our members act as coaches for these teams. And it's really neat. I know that baseball is not a big deal in the UK, but obviously it is the national pastime for America. And seeing a kid with a glove that has the little square and compass burned into it, it's just a really cool thing. Really sets, obviously, good tone with the community about part of what we're all about. And then we do a lot of scholarships for public schools, teachers, and students. So what does the future hold? So as you heard, I'm in new lodge development. So we have new lodges growing in California, and we're seeing a lot of lodges get revitalized. So with new lodges, we are strategically growing the fraternity through areas that are currently could sustain more Freemasonry than is in those direct communities, as well as placing lodges in areas where there has never been a lodge within the state. This creates new opportunities for community and membership engagement overall. Revitalizing lodges, re-identifying while building culture and relevancy. This is a really big push that we had where lodges tend to go, oh, we're doing all these things and no one's showing up. We're having a hard time finding prospects. Our members aren't as engaged. Well, then when you find out they haven't really reevaluated who their membership is, what their membership is really interested in, and they're usually spinning on this idea of their own personal heyday. So one guy's personal heyday, let's say, was 1982. So he wants things to operate like they were in 1982 because that to him is the best version of whatever happened in Masonry. This guy's best version is 96. That guy's best version is 78. This guy's best version is 2010. Regardless, evaluate who your membership is now, what their wants and desires are external to the Masonic experience, and start tailoring the lodge around what your actual members who are showing up want versus trying to maintain traditions, which are not just outdated, they are no longer relevant because the times have changed. So you need to look at how can you be of service to the members that you have, which ultimately will help you identify your culture, your identity, and then help you figure out, well, since we now know who we are and what we're into and what's successful for us, we know what kind of candidates we want to bring to this specific lodge, which then creates, obviously, a very good, healthy relationship and builds a strong lodge. As Masonic education and research and that type of information becomes much more commonplace in Masonic culture, we're seeing that it's engaging its members, it's building better retention and helping in recruitment. So when I came into Masonry, which was not that long ago, about a decade ago, I came in because I was very interested in the history of Freemasonry, the factual names and dates and places and the story of the development of Freemasonry. And I found that a lot of lodges didn't really care about that too much, which is fine. However, I had to form a new lodge in order to find a home with brethren who cared about that kind of stuff, external to a research lodge. But we're finding that lodges in general are now getting more hip to this. And they're doing a lot of what research lodges, at least in this state, were doing for a period of years. So this is certainly starting to work its way into the culture, and they're seeing a benefit from it. Technology, simplifying the business of the lodge, staying connected and building not just interstate, but national and international bridges for collaboration and fellowship. During this time of COVID, I think that we found that the Masonic world is a lot smaller. The world became a lot smaller. We were all connecting, as we're doing today, through virtual means. And I'm a firm proponent in reaching out and having conversations, talking, getting to know brethren in other places, because ultimately there's a lot that can be shared. And I think that that's really important for all of us, because I think we all have something that we can take away from each other to help implement in our own situation. But we also have things that, we can teach each other. So stronger initiatives between the Grand Lodge and the Progressive Orders, Grand Lodge and philanthropic and civic organizations. This is a push just to help kind of bring everybody back to home, bring everybody back to square one, but also help normalize the idea of people being Masons that are proud to say such. They're not hiding their membership, which is not a big thing in America, but still, I think, as you all know, there can be a lot of bad information out there in the world as to what we do, who we are, where we come from, what we're about. So being able to normalize, as I know that Dr. David Staples has got a huge push on this, but in our own way, help normalize that idea of, yes, we promote these virtues and ideas to build better men and leaders. And those types of virtues should start playing a role in people that are, ultimately trying to really do good in the community. Like, don't just say you're doing good within the lodge and pat each other on the back about how great this is or great that is. We want our Masons to get out there, be a shining light in your community, whatever that looks like. But be a shining light, be a force for good. So ultimately, being able to normalize Masonry helps, I believe, people engage in various capacities and different types of organizations without it feeling like, oh, the Masons, they're just like this or they're just like that. It's like, no, we want people to know what we do and what we're about and how this person is potentially really an asset because of what they believe in and what they stand for. And also, we focus a lot around and are seeing a great deal, obviously, out of leadership development for young leaders and seasoned leaders alike, to really kind of bridge some gaps, come together and make a true change, and be able to build some bridges and some strong foundation for the future. So in conclusion, brethren, what I would say is, regardless of jurisdictional differences, the spirit and purpose of the craft is universal. From our end, as new lodges are formed and seasoned lodges are revitalized, we see more opportunities for new membership engagement, informational, or some people might call that recruitment opportunities, and community charity involvement. And Freemasonry ultimately is going to still offer that traditional space in an ever-changing world. We will continue to evolve with the times while retaining our core principles, our tenets, our teachings for hundreds of years to come. And with that, I thank you for allowing me to be here today and speak with you. And I certainly am open to Q&A if anyone is interested in throwing anything my way.
So if you do have any questions, please type them using the chat on Zoom or the comments on YouTube, and I'll be keeping a look at those. First of all, I've got a couple of comments as well. First of all, one prompt in a meeting sounds like heaven, rather than having lots of people chip in. Just on the diagram that you showed in the lodge room, I noticed that the secretary and treasurer were sitting in the east on either side of the master, but there was a table opposite the junior warden where we would normally in this country see the secretary and treasurer sit. Who is that for?
Actually, I think that's just thrown in there as really, it's more of a block in the sense of that would be the north for us, and no officer would ever sit in the north, because in our lectures, there's mention of the north being a dark a dark place due to light coming in through certain windows, et cetera, et cetera. So typically no one sits there. Now during a business meeting, let's say, it'll be filled with brethren. And we kind of have a joke here that the immediate past master should sit over there. The joke is that he doesn't hassle the new master as he's getting his feet wet and whispering too much good counsel. But that in the image is just more, I believe, just a block that no one would be sitting in that area.
You put in the immediate past master over there. Yeah, that's yeah, I can imagine that. There's a couple of questions coming in about the number of meetings, and obviously, in this province, kind of 6 to 10 meetings a year is normal. As you know from London, kind of 3 to 5 meetings a year is normal. 8 to 10 a month sounds rather a lot. Does that kind of commitment have a negative impact upon newer members, or because they don't know any different, that's just what they get?
So I'll speak personally about this. I should have stated also at the beginning of this presentation that when I give you my personal interpretation, I'm speaking for myself, not for any entity. So
sure.
Yes, it does. I genuinely believe that a lot of the newer lodges, less is more. We're still mandated per our book of rules in order to hold those 12 business meetings in the year. It's 1 per month. It's in our constitution. It's in our bylaws. And due to, we went through a shift, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to answer this a bit in a more of a long-winded way, but there's more info as to why. We had something happen in America back in the 1800s called the Morgan Affair. Some of you might have heard of it, some maybe not. Well, needless to say, this Mason named William Morgan wrote an expose, which was not a real expose, painting Freemasonry as almost this demonic cult. Well, sadly, a lot of people believed this, and it killed Grand Lodges. It killed entire jurisdictions. So the thing is that after that, we went to, if you're going to hold a meeting, you need to hold it on the 3rd degree, because that's how this ends up happening. We get these newer looky-loo members who join with the intent, honestly, of taking information and then using it for their own fictions. This was a popular thing. So we went to meeting on the 3rd degree, and it went to this place of needing to hold these monthly business patterns, these business meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And then just as of about, I want to say 8 years ago, California, we flipped it and said, well, let's start meeting on the 1st degree now. Well, and I think that a lot of the younger members at that point thought, this is going to be great. Like, this is like the moment where I get to go into that meeting that's held every month. And they find out it's just a business meeting. So it's not a huge payoff. And as obviously this makes sense, as I was saying, a lot of lodges own property, but as real estate progressively goes up in California, the days of that are done. I mean, no one wants to pull together and buy a Masonic hall. So, I believe that a lot of the younger members that now are, let's say, officers at this point in their career are saying, yeah, we really don't need that much. So there's conversation around, how can we potentially reduce those meetings, even though it's in the Constitution, and obviously in a way that's congruent with how you put forth legislation to consider this. And also, how can we make those business meetings easier? So the younger lodges are doing less. So with that being said, they might do degrees quarterly, a degree ceremony quarterly. So they still have that mandated business meeting, whatever that looks like for them. They just need a quorum to handle it. Then you could have, like, this is the time we initiate during the year. That's the time we pass. That's the time we raise. However, when you go to a lodge that's made up more of brothers who are retired, they love the idea of being able to be out of the house that much. They love it. They just love, because for them, it's a great point of sociability. And a lot of it's casual. A lot of it is not dressed up. A lot of it's an LOI where you're in your shirt and tennis shoes and you have a cup of coffee, or you have, let's say within the month, 2 times you have to dress up. The rest of it, they can come kibitz on the sideline, and that's kind of like fun. But for the younger guys, they're like, oh my gosh, I have to get up and go to work tomorrow. I can't keep doing this. So you see a real contrast in culture, but things are changing to make it more palatable and manageable for younger members. So that was a long walk to get you to that answer, but I had to share it to talk more about the culture in general.
Just thinking of that development, there's a question that's come in regarding the ritual books and how they're written in cipher and not in plain English. Is that something again that's do you identify that kind of thing as a barrier to entry, if you will, or is that something that again is part of the learning process?
Well, let's put it this way. When I pick up an emulation ritual book, I feel no less satisfied that I can read it than how I had to learn Preston-Webb, the California version of Preston-Webb ritual, through me and a brother sitting down. And it is mouth to ear because it's in cipher, it's in prompt. So in reality, you're learning it from hearing it, and you're going back and forth. And up until I believe it was the early 90s, those books were a no-no. Lodges had one book, they kept it in a safe, and when the PMs would start arguing about something, they'd pull it out to settle the argument. But that's part of the culture, I believe, to a degree, in our brand of Masonry, is sitting down with a brother and going back and forth and learning the ritual like this. However, if we put it in plain English, it would bother me none, because I'm split on this conversation, because I think that it's good that a brother can go home, pick up his book and learn it. However, in our culture, then you're missing that aspect of mentor and student, so to speak, where they get that interaction. But ultimately, will it end up going to plain English? I'm not on the ritual committee, so I don't know.
Okay. Just thinking about distances that people travel to get there and the commitment of going to a meeting. California is quite a big place. And presumably there aren't lodges just necessarily down the road a few miles. It's
not always.
Kind of, what types of commuting, if you will, commitment are you looking at for a lodge? Obviously it depends on where it is, but what's the kind of extremes from one end to another?
Sure. So most people live within a 15 to 25 mile radius of where their lodge is. However, as I was kind of talking about, there's different cultures within lodges. So my lodge in Oakland, California, and I know that the geography might not make a difference to everybody, but you have San Francisco, you have a bridge called the Bay Bridge. Oakland is on the other side of that Bay Bridge. We have members, because of the types of activities or the culture that my lodge has, that come in from Sacramento for a meeting, and Sacramento is 2 hours north. So I think that it really depends on what your lodge is doing, what kind of culture you want to be involved with. So you could find people that are willing to take that extra drive, but for the most part, people live within 15 to 25 miles of their lodge, and sometimes a lot less. It just depends. So those are the average commutes. I mean, I know some inspectors that oversee districts that are very far stretched, and they can drive hours one way, hours the other way to get back. So it really depends.
Sure. Thinking about kind of the new lodges which you've consecrated, or is that what you refer to as consecrated lodges? Or
we have two ceremonies. So the first one is called institution, which is really where the Grand Master and the Grand Officers show up, and they there's a ceremony. It's a public, it's open, it's an open ceremony, and they they issue the dispensation. And so for a year, this lodge works UD, or under dispensation. And then if they've done well and they've come together and they're doing right, they will apply for charter at the annual communication of Grand Lodge. So Grand Lodge for us only meets once per year formally. And so then they'll apply for charter, and then it comes up for a vote amongst the entire membership. So the entire membership has to vote on whether the lodge gets formed, which I think is kind of funny, but it's there. I mean, nobody ever says no. You know what I mean? It's just like, okay, yes, that's wonderful. But then we have what's called a constitution ceremony. And then within the constitution ceremony is the consecration. It happens in that ceremony.
Sure. Thinking about kind of those new lodges put up, are they targeted specifically to cover, to enhance the demographics and diversity, ethnic diversity within the Grand Lodge of California, or is it just where there's a gap, that's where we'll try and put a lodge?
Okay, so, well, generally speaking, if a lodge is, let's say, no lodge is ever created for the sake of promoting diversity, if that makes sense. It's because members have to be the ones who come and say, hey, we would like to form a new lodge. Now, some lodges, just as anything in the world, might end up being made up predominantly of someone of a certain ethnicity. Great, whatever, it's just, it's all about Masonry. We're all brothers. So no, but we would never create one for the intent of that. It would just end up being natural grassroots from the members that want to do it. Where I get more involved in having conversations with brothers around the formation is in areas where either A, we can sustain a lot bigger Masonic footprint, or in areas where there is none. What I tend to notice with the new lodges, though, going back to, like, in essence, why are they being formed? It's usually because you have a group of brothers that share a passion and have a vision of what they want their Masonic experience to be like. And they want to form a craft lodge that supports that vision and then draws in other people that are interested in a similar vision.
Yeah. In a moment, I'm going to come on to some of the different degrees, or at least the kind of progression and sort of start point and end point in that. I'll come on to that in a second. I just want to kind of keep going on the topic of sort of new members and regeneration, and obviously you've also mentioned that a lodge may charge up to kind of $2,500 membership. That's a lot of money, and it was, you said it was typically the newer lodges that were charging that kind of thing. Is that just is that to some extent how can I put this, a manufactured price to increase the significance of membership, i.e. it's expensive, therefore it must be something really special? Or is it simply the case of they need to have that much money because there's a lot of things that they need to pay for over a period of time, and as the lodge grows and matures, that money will come down?
Ultimately, it has to do with whatever the operating costs are. So as lodges determine where they're going to meet, perhaps what they want within their culture. And also you have to think of it like this. You could have a lodge that says, well, it'd be really nice to present our newly raised Master Mason with his white apron, which ultimately is going to cost the lodge probably somewhere between $75 to $125. You could have another lodge that says, well, we have a custom lodge apron and we present this to him, but ultimately it costs X amount of hundreds of dollars. That's just one thing. And then you kind of start going through, well, what does it cost to do the degrees, other elements, admin costs? You equate obviously into your fees. What does it cost to meet in a certain place per year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really it's just, in my mind, it always is operating costs. Or additionally, a lodge might say, we're very into philanthropy. We anticipate that our lodge as a whole is going to give X amount to the Masonic Foundation every year. So subs could be high because the lodge itself is going to make a contribution. So really it's a case-by-case basis, but I have yet to see a lodge attempt to justify a high number on subs. And I get exactly what you mean. It's like, well, hey, if it costs that much, it must be wonderful. Ultimately, the proof is in the pudding. If a lodge is not doing all the things it should be, you're not going to get people that are going to be willing to pay subs. People will, however, be able to pay the higher price if they feel there's the, I don't want to call it bang for your buck, but they understand what's going on and they're intimately engaged, so they know where that money's going. However, that high of a price range, I gave it as a spectrum. That would be the absolute highest. Yeah. That's not common for everyone. It's more, I think, for our new lodges, to be frank, I think it's somewhere between 365 to 600 is probably the average subs right there.
Sure. Visiting in this country is obviously part of the lifeblood of Masonry. How much kind of into visiting do you get between lodges in the States?
You do get a bit of visiting. It's not as an intricate part of the culture as it is in English Freemasonry, and I'm well aware of how important visitation is. I think part of the reason why, personally, is because I think that sometimes when you're in a jurisdiction where everyone's working the same ritual, you kind of start getting this idea of I'm walking into the same thing. every single time. Now, what changes that is if you have friends in another lodge and you like them and you get on well. So it's not the same thing of, oh, I'm going to go check out this lodge because I heard they do something differently. That's few and far between. It's going to end up being more about, I already have friends over there, or our lodges have been closely associated for the past 150 years, and we always go do this, that, and the other. It's part of the experience, but it certainly is not played up as integral to it as you might find.
Sure. Going on to kind of the more advanced degrees now. Mm-hmm. In this country, there's a specific question about 33rd degree. And to be honest, it's not my area of expertise, this. But a lot of, there aren't very many people in this country who are 33rd degree Masons. But there are more in the US. Can you talk a bit more about kind of the what it's possible to achieve out of your state, if you will, within kind of America, as opposed to just within the lodge, within the Grand Lodge?
Sure. So do you just want me to kind of give you a rundown of our progressive orders?
I think yeah.
Okay, so we have obviously the Royal Arch, Royal and Select Masters Councils, Knights Templar / Knights of Malta. We call them commanderies. That's the term that we utilize. You have Royal Order of Scotland, Red Cross of Constantine, Allied Masonic degrees, the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, and I'll talk about that maybe a little bit more since there's interest in that. Beyond that, you have some groups that we sponsor, which are youth oriented. So they're not becoming little Masons. It's just youth orders that we sponsor, both male and female. And there's even some ladies organizations where they're not becoming Masons, but it's a ladies organization that we sponsor. That stems from a guy named Rob Morris, who Mike Kearsley, if any of you have heard of him, a member of a Quota Coronati Lodge, he writes extensively about Rob Morris. In essence, we have KTP. We have all the same progressive orders, SRICF, you have SRIA. We have, in essence, all the same orders, except our Allied Masonic degrees covers some that you have your own grand bodies for. So for an example, Royal Ark Mariners, that's in AMD for us. Order of the Secret Monitor, that's in AMD. Scarlet Cord, that's in AMD. Red Branch Airy, that's in AMD. And we work the chair degrees and the whole bit. But it just changes a little bit, and some of the mandates are different. So going back to the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, so the way that the ancient and accepted Rite in England developed, and I'm well versed in this because it's actually an area I'm super interested in, hence why I'm being perfected in England. But it received its patent from the Northern Masonic jurisdiction during a time when there was a real divide between the Southern jurisdiction and the Northern Masonic jurisdiction. The Southern jurisdiction for the Scottish Rite in America had sway over almost all the United States, while the Northern Masonic jurisdiction was a much smaller nook. For a certain time, there were some membership differences in, like, you had to profess a Christian faith in one, the other one you didn't have to. And so that altered the way that these degrees developed. In the Southern jurisdiction of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, it is not a chivalric aspects are part of it, but it's much more a mystery school idea that is open to anyone and everyone that's a Master Mason. The Northern jurisdiction is that way now too. And this 33rd situation, so the way that Albert Pike helped formulate a different set of honors was that in America, when you join the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, you're guaranteed to become a 32nd. It's just to us considered the degree where that's where you stop. You become a 32nd degree, which I know in England that's not the case. 18th, you have to serve as sovereign, and then you'll be invited into the 30th, et cetera, et cetera. But here he determined that the 32nd was the point where you would get to. Well, from there, they created an honor called KCCH, Knight Commander Court of Honor. So it's a little ceremony. It's a little step up. You're still a 32nd, but your hat changes color. And then they have serious. And then after that, you have what are called honorary 33rds. So honorary 33rds are brothers who have given a ton of their time, but they're never going to become IGs. They're never going to become inspector generals. So they created a ceremony for these guys where they receive a white hat. We call them white hats. It's an honorary 33rd. It's an honor. It just means you've been around a long time. You've given a lot of your time, a lot of your talent. So you're being honored. However, then we have sovereign grand inspector generals who are what we call true 33rds. And their degree is not the same thing. That's the honor for the 33rds. So there's a clear distinction. They are aware of the distinction, and they are also aware that in other countries, the Supreme Council handles honors and the way that degree progression works differently. So it's not a thing of you're never going to get someone that's a white hat, an honorary, claiming to be a true inspector general. He's going to say, I'm honorary, because he knows there's a clear distinction between those two things. So I hope that helps answer that a little bit.
I just want to draw on something. I'm getting a couple of direct messages regarding kind of racial differences in lodges, and I'm thinking particularly of Prince Hall lodges and how they have developed. Again, not my area of expertise. It's why you're here. But just thinking about, is there a Prince Hall Lodge in California, or and how much interaction is there between Grand Lodge of California and the Prince Hall Lodge of California?
So we do have a Grand Lodge of Prince Hall Masons in California. I have never visited a Prince Hall Lodge. However, what I do know is that our relationship is good, and it's constantly growing. We have there at our annual communications. As far as I'm aware, we're at theirs. And there's a good relationship there. I know that and once again, this is me speaking, not an institution speaking. I know that there are some states within the USA, I think a very, very, very small amount, that maybe have recognition issues. We don't. So regular Prince Hall Masonry is no different than any other regular Grand Lodge that we're in amity with.
And do you work with them, and kind of talking about the new lodges which have been founded, do you work with them in terms of locations and maybe looking at founding a new lodge in a particular area? Would you take into consideration where their lodges were as well?
Not really, because we share we're two jurisdictions. So Prince Hall, Grand Lodge, California. However, we don't. I work for the Grand Lodge of California. So that type of business of where new lodges get set up ultimately falls in our court, as well as falls in theirs when they're creating new lodges for themselves. But no, we don't work together on that type of platform. I know that they're wishing us the best, and they want to see us keep going, and we want to see them keep going. So that's about that.
I've just been asked what a Prince Hall Lodge is. Can you?
Okay, so
my fault, not yours.
I know. I'm going to try my best here, but I'm not an expert on Prince Hall Masonry. However, a long time ago in the 1700s, there was a man named Prince Hall, an African-American man who was made a Mason. And then he ultimately ended up forming a lodge called Africa Lodge No. 1. I believe this was in Massachusetts. If someone is here that can correct me on this, please feel free to do so. But ultimately, he created, during a time of racial divide in this country as well as in others, he created a form of African Masonry in America. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, that Africa Lodge was chartered by the Grand Lodge of England, I believe by the Premier Grand Lodge, through letters, through communications. There might be some questions about that. Like I said, I'm not an expert. However, Prince Hall Masonry has grown and flourished throughout the United States. So there are many Grand Lodges and subordinate or private lodges under that, but it is its own jurisdiction, and it's not because there's not an issue of it doesn't have to. I'm trying to put this correctly. It's not because lodges are segregated. That's not true at all. It's just because it's its own jurisdiction, and it's been that way since a long time back. And I think that maintaining your heritage, your customs and cultures within your branch of Freemasonry is super important, regardless of where you're at or where you come from. That's really important.
Sure, it's fair to say it's predominantly Afro-American, isn't it? Membership.
Yes, predominantly.
It's
yes.
not exclusively Afro-American.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And presumably, are there any people who are members of both Grand Lodge of California and Prince Hall Grand Lodge of California?
I have no clue how it operates in other states, but within our state, there is no cross membership. Just to however that piece of the jurisdictional talk works out, but it doesn't equate to anything negative. It's just currently what it is.
Sure. It's absolutely fascinating to talk about this kind of thing, and how Grand Lodge of California is developing, looking at, having over the last year, when it's been crazy and all over the world, to be able to be constituting, or at least initiating new, what did you call it? Inaugurating new lodges.
Well, virtually, our ritual committee worked on, virtually, what does it look like to institute? So once again, this is not consecrated. It will only be done in person. This is what can it.
I just failed
like?
the test.
No. Hey, we've been using a lot of terminology today. So they worked that out fairly quickly, and so we instituted 4 new lodges last year during September, and then this year thus far we have another one, and we're going to have a series of a few more, I believe, that ultimately will probably end up being done virtually, even though we're slowly the lodges are starting to meet again in person because of state requirements being eased around gatherings. However, I think a lot of Masonry this year is going to remain virtual still.
What have lodges been able to do over the past year? Have they been meeting virtually? Have they been doing ceremonies? Have they been what kind of things have they been covering?
So no ceremonies, no degree work, obviously. What they've been doing is a lot of staying in touch, a lot of communications. The Grand Lodge of California, we started our speaker series, which we've been so lucky has been so engaging for our membership and for people the world over. It always shocks me where we get attendees from, as well. A lot of lodges, safely, were doing various things that they could for their communities. It was a time where people had to get creative. This hasn't been seen in America since the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. And there was a lot of looking back at what did we do during that time when this hit, and learning from the past and trying to maneuver things for the future. So really, it was a lot of staying in touch, a lot of communications, and a lot of education, and a lot of perpetual check-ins to make sure that people are doing well and doing what each one of us could charitably to make sure that we were contributing somehow, some way.
Great. I've just had a message to say that tonight's Freemasons Without Borders lecture at 6:00 London time is on Prince Hall Masonry, which is I'm getting a link.
Great.
I'll pop that in the chat on YouTube and on Zoom as well. So if you want to learn more about Prince Hall Masonry, you can come to that lecture.
I was going to say, if someone wants to learn a great deal more than what I just said, please tune into that talk.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily my full expertise.
It's been hearing what you were saying, particularly about kind of reviving and rejuvenating lodges, I think strikes hits a lot of chords with the kind of work that we've been doing as a province and in UGLE over the last year or so, thinking about kind of more about the members and what the future direction of the lodge is. So it seems as though there's lots of there are lots of parallels between the development. I'd like to thank you for taking the time and getting up early in the morning to come and talk to us. It's been absolutely fascinating.
My pleasure.
The feedbacks, all what people are saying has been really good. So, Michael, thank you for being here, and I'm sure we'll see you soon. I'm going to hang around now and just take any questions, if anybody has any general questions about kind of the restart and things like that. One thing I am going to do is say goodbye to the YouTube viewers. So thank you for watching on YouTube. Again, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you here again next week when we're talking about the Red Cross of Constantine. So same time next week. So goodbye to YouTube. Thank you. and they have gone.